Hey,
Hi,
hi,
Chris.
hi,
Ca-
Rick.
Calling Chris Anderson in Windsor.
Still in Windsor, yeah,
Still in
and
Windsor.
you're in Chicago.
Still in the bookshelf. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
The wait
thanks.
continues.
Thanks for that. Thanks for that.
I just thought I'd mention that. Yeah.
Thanks.
I'm in Chicago, where it's about 28 degrees outside, although 90 degrees in the hallway. Just
Yeah,
advertising that fact because of various building problems.
yeah,
So much fun.
yeah.
Welcome
Welcome.
everybody to History Happy Hour. Thanks to Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours for their assistance in bringing you this show. You can check out their military history tours at stephenambrosetours.com. Today we're going to be talking about the Tuskegee Airmen, specifically those who were MIA. And whether you're watching live, watching on replay, or listening in your car to the HHH
Podcast.
podcast. Yeah.
Podcast.
I did. Welcome. Hey, so Chris, it is Super Bowl Sunday.
Is it?
It is. I know you're
Okay. You say
have
so.
absolutely don't care anything at all about that.
Mhm,
But think of it this way: that
mhm.
this is the last Sunday for 6 months that we have to compete with football.
I know, right? Because now really the beautiful game is going to be the focus of everybody's attention.
Yes, yes, and baseball isn't always played on Sunday afternoons. So,
By the way,
and go
no,
ahead.
go ahead.
Oh
No, no.
no. I know what you wanted. You have
Well, I
something
just
you want
wanted
to
to give.
say.
You
Go
know,
ahead.
for anybody here of our viewers who are living here in the UK, you'll appreciate this. But I had a bit of a shocked visit to the emergency room this weekend, and I want to thank all the members of the National Health Service staff who took really good care of me and made sure that I was here on Sunday night to be able to do the show. They were fantastic, and the NHS is a wonderful organization full of really incredible people. So thank you. So that's what I wanted to say.
Okay, and you're in the right country for your healthcare.
I am.
Okay, and our last announcement here, I should just say thank you to all of our Patreon supporters.
Oh, absolutely. Just
And we're going to do a chat with Patreon supporters, our Top Shelf supporters, on Tuesday, I think. So I'll be sending out a link to that to our
special invite.
Patreon Top Shelf supporters, and you can, of course, become one at patreon.com/history happy hour. And I should mention, Jane Byers is trying to join as a Top Shelf person, and she's going to end up sending us a check. And she said, "Oh, I don't care about my name being up there and mentioning me, but I like to mention everybody who supports
Absolutely.
us." So we appreciate that. Guys, anybody out there, Chris, who we got?
Yes. Well, Susan Yu has joined us. Ken from Kansas. Nancy's back from Houston. Gwendolyn Grimes Simmons from Frederick, Maryland. I miss Frederick. Frederick is great. Frank from Mass. David Otley's joining us from Normandy. Yeah, Jack Sadler.
Oh, David. Fantastic. Shall we get going?
I think we should. Right.
All right. Give me a cue.
The bar is open.
Yeah, it is. So listen, during World War II, 27 Tuskegee Airmen were reported missing in combat, and the remains of most were never found. NPR investigative reporter Cheryl Thompson, who's the daughter of a Tuskegee Airman, has written a book exploring their lives, their families, and the search for their remains. And her book is called Forgotten Souls, The Search for the Lost Tuskegee Airmen. It just came out, I think, on January 27th. Cheryl, as I mentioned, is an investigative reporter for NPR. She's worked for the Washington Post for 20 years. She has more than 40 journalism awards, including she is a winner of a Pulitzer Prize. So Cheryl, we welcome you and those of your awards that we can see on the wall to History Happy Hour. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me. I got to clarify one thing. I was part of teams that won Pulitzers. I always make that distinction.
Okay, I still think you won a Pulitzer Prize, so I am sticking with my story and what I said. But your integrity is noted and appreciated. So Cheryl, you come to this story with a family connection because your dad was a Tuskegee Airman. So tell us a little bit about him and how old were you when you learned about his service, what did it mean to you growing up?
So I always say that my dad talked a lot about the military when I have two older brothers, when we were growing up. However, I didn't pay close attention. And now, of course, I regret that because I know he used to tell stories. And I remember there were times when some of his fellow military guys would come by the house, and visit. Or I remember one time my dad was in Los Angeles visiting my brother, and one of the guys came by to see him. I sort of knew about his military experience growing up. But again, my dad was from that era where he was very quiet. You wouldn't know he was in the room. Those men back then were very humble, and they didn't talk a lot about themselves and what they did then. But I know he was proud of his military service. That I am certain of.
So I think, Cheryl, like, I mean, it's hard to imagine now. I mean, since the Tuskegee Airmen are very well known, but we should probably kind of do a little sort of background. So you mentioned Public Law 18 in April 1939. President Roosevelt signs that. What is Public Law 18, and what does that kind of set in motion?
Well, it's set in motion. Hang on a second. I'm sorry, I'm losing you here.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
That better?
Yeah. So let me back up. The Tuskegee Airmen did not get that moniker initially, right? That was given to them later. These were men. It was really Eleanor Roosevelt who was very instrumental in helping these men to become pilots. She had gone and she wanted to fly with them because they were like, oh, these men can't fly. And she got into the cockpit with one of them and they took her out. And you can imagine that her security detail was just, they were livid, like, oh my God, she's going out with these black pilots. And she came back and she said, you know what, these guys really can fly. And so she was very instrumental in making sure that these men got their wings. And also the black press was instrumental. The Pittsburgh Black Press and the NAACP and the National Urban League, they were all very instrumental in this because this was a military that was very segregated and didn't want these men as pilots. They didn't think they were smart enough. They didn't think they were good enough. They didn't think they could really adapt and to learn how to fly these planes. And in fact, they were good at what they did.
Yeah. How did they recruit pilots for this unit? I mean, how did that word get out? Was it done through black colleges, or was there some other route for the recruiting?
Yes, the black colleges, I believe there were 7 of them, and they went through them to say, hey, we've got this program, we've got this pilot, literally like a pilot program, but a pilot program, and they recruited them that way. And other times they were, these men, everybody knew there was a war going on. And so, some of them were drafted and some of them, most of them enlisted, and they had a chance. They learned about the program and they had a chance to be a part of it. And so they jumped at it. It was a great opportunity. It was something they never thought they could do growing up, and these men came from all over the country. It wasn't like they just came from the South. They were from California and Iowa and Texas. And so that's how they learned about it, through their universities and also through word of mouth and through the black press advertising it.
Mm-hmm. And Cheryl, you had mentioned already that, they got the moniker Tuskegee Airmen later. So could you tell us about how they wound up at Tuskegee? And it was a pretty unique setup.
Well, it was. They were searching for a place to train these men, right? And one of the places they considered was actually Chicago and right outside Chicago. But there was because as Rick and I we've got that Chicago connection.
That's exactly right. Yeah, go ahead.
But there was, Chicago has this little thing called politics. And it was very political. And they were like, okay, like, we got enough issues. Do we really need to have a political place? So they were looking for a place that was sort of less volatile, maybe, than outside of Chicago. And so they settled on Alabama, even though, it was the Jim Crow South. There were issues there. They still thought that it would be it would be less volatile to have it in the South. And the weather was better, at least that was their story, that the weather was better in the South. And so it was more conducive to flying than, setting up shop in Chicago or the suburbs of Chicago.
I really hadn't thought about this before reading your book, but it is sort of a weird decision, right? I mean, if you're going to assemble all these black pilot candidates to say, hey, and let's do this in one of the most racist, segregated parts of the country. Oh, that's a good idea. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that? Or was it just, hey, it's a war and we're moving fast and these things just happen?
Well, I think it was well, in terms of, I think they thought it was well thought out, right? It's like, which is the lesser of the evils, Chicago, where there are issues, or the South, where there are issues, but we can deal with the race. And so they settled on Tuskegee.
Yeah. Well, one of the other things, again, that struck me about the Tuskegee situation was that because of segregation and the racism, unlike most military bases, all the people that would serve in the airmen, they're there at Tuskegee. I mean, it's like a totally sort of contained community, not just the pilots training, right? I mean, you talked about African-American nurses and ground crew, and it's all kind of happening there. So I was kind of curious. My impression was that then that would lead to much greater unit cohesion and sort of unit integrity. And what do you think the impact of all of these guys, not just the pilots, being together there had on the unit going forward?
Oh, I think so. So that Tuskegee Army Airfield, right, which was built in the very early 40s, was. Let me back up. Tuskegee was not a welcoming place for these men, or any of the blacks who came there, right? Tuskegee was not. It was Alabama. Yep. It was not welcoming, and so they decided to build this Tuskegee Army Airfield, and it was basically their home away from home. Everything, they had everything on that base. It was 1,700 acres of, a hospital, a PX, the dormitories. They had an entertainment complex. They had all of these things so that they wouldn't have to go into town, because they were not welcome in town. Even though there was a huge black population back then in Tuskegee, they still were not wanted there. And so that Army Airfield became that was their home.
Yeah. And so what made you, in approaching this topic, so you have a family connection, what made you decide to focus on the missing? Because that's a very specific slice of the story. So what drew you to that?
Well, I will tell you, I was still at the Washington Post at the time. This was 2018. And one of my colleagues had done this story, this amazing story on the remains of someone that the government thought may have been a Tuskegee Airman, a missing Tuskegee Airman from, 70 plus years ago. And so the story, rightfully so, ran on the front page of the Post. And it was such an intriguing story of, after all of this time, all of these decades, they found the remains of somebody who might have been one of these black pilots. And so when I talked to my colleague about it, I asked him, Michael Wayne is his name, and I asked him, I said, do you think there are others? And he knew somewhere along the way, or I told him somewhere along the way, that my dad was a Tuskegee Airman. And I said to him, do you think there are others? And he says, oh yeah, there are absolutely others. And I said, well, that's your book. And he said, no, Cheryl, this is your book. And I thought, wow, okay. And it still took me a few years, because, I can write a news story. I can do an investigative piece. I can write a magazine story, but 70,000 words, it was a little, intimidating, even for somebody like me, who I'm not afraid of a whole lot, but that frightened me. And so I thought about it and thought about it and thought about it and talked to people. And then I decided, okay, you know what? I'm going to do it. And that's how it came about. But, I wasn't quite sure how I was going to do it. But it was intriguing because it was those 27, well, now 26 at that time, because they had identified the remains of the one pilot, Captain Dixon. And I thought, well, what, because there's so much that's been written about the Tuskegee Airmen. And I should add too, Tuskegee Airmen were more than pilots, right? There were 14,000 of them. They were women, they were medics. They were, my dad ended up as a medic because he had trouble landing the planes. And they were the mechanics, and they were support staff, and they were all of these people. And so I think sometimes people think Tuskegee Airmen were just the pilots. No, they were in fact more than that. And so I all of these things have been written about them over the years, and I thought, well, what hasn't been written about them? And it was these missing men. And so I thought, well, maybe I could track down these families, and they could tell me their stories and what their lives have been like. Because during my research, I found that some of them had wives, and then some of them had children, and a lot of them had siblings. And so, it was a matter of really like tracking down these people and hoping to get them to tell me their stories.
Yeah. So Cheryl, we had a question, and this is kind of circling back a little bit to the start of the unit.
Good though.
But this is from Wally Morrison. I'll put this up here. And Wally wanted to know, I assume white officers and staff trained these men. What was their relationship with the pilots? Was it tolerance, or did it morph into respect and friendship? And then I would add to that, if you could also talk to us a little bit about General Noel Parrish, because he sort of plays an interesting role in this. So
okay. And
take it away.
As I tell my students, ask one question at a time, or else I'm going to answer the easiest one first. But I'm going to take Wallace's question.
Okay.
Can you put it back up there for me? So I think it was a little bit of all of those things. I think, yes, they were trained by white because there were no black pilots. So they had to be trained by white pilots. And the relationship, I think, was a little bit of everything. I think it was tolerance, but I also think it morphed into respect. I'm not quite sure about the friendship, but certainly respect, because I know this much based on the documents and my research is that General, and he was a Brigadier General, Noel Parrish, was the first guy who oversaw all of them, right? And so, and those pilots really had respect for him, and I think it was mutual. I think he did the best he could with trying to make sure that they learned everything they could and were taught like the white pilots were. I really do think he tried to look out for them. And of course, then General Benjamin O. Davis Jr. Took over, and they they had mad respect for him. They were intimidated by it. But they respected him. So I think I really do think it was a little of everything. It was, they had to tolerate him. They didn't have a choice, right? Yeah. These black men were in it for the long haul. Yep. And so there had to be a level of tolerance, but also there was, they genuinely liked Parrish, and I think he genuinely liked some of them.
And so after the unit goes overseas, then does he continue in Tuskegee training replacements, or is he only?
Yeah, no, you're testing my memory here.
Oh, I'm sorry, I don't know.
No, that's okay. I think General Davis took over, and of course went over, and they formed the 332nd Fighter Group, and in that there were 4 fighter squadrons, the 99th, which Davis oversaw first, and then the 100th, the 301st, and the 302nd. And that was his role over there. But yeah, because the whites had to teach these guys because they didn't have anybody. Yeah. And so some of them did it, some of them did it, I think, out of a social consciousness thing too. And some of them thought, well, if I'm training these men at Tuskegee, I don't have to go and fight overseas. I can stay here to my family. And so I think it was a little bit of a lot of things.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, I was just looking up something here. How you went about finding these families. I mean, you ended up talking to, as you mentioned, children, siblings, cousins, etc. Were you surprised that you were able to track down so many? And please feel free to give a shout out to your researcher, Alice, who I know assisted you on this.
Oh my God, Alice Kreitz is like the best researcher in journalism. We go back to our days at the Washington Post, and you know, my line with Alice is, if Alice can't find you, you don't exist. Okay, because she could just unearth everybody. And so I called on her when I needed her, you know, if I was stuck trying to find somebody and I could maybe find a second cousin, she could find a first. And so it was, you know, I say that journalism is a lot about luck. I really believe that. And in this book, I got lucky with a lot of things. I mean, I would, when I started researching and I went to St. Louis to the personnel files, which are kept at, you know, the National Archives in St. Louis. I went through each individual file. Some of them were burned because there was a fire in 1973 that destroyed millions of records. But, you know, I just went through it page by page. And I remember in one instance, there was a woman, there was nothing, no relative or anything. There was one person listed in this guy's file, and it was an insurance. It was a bond, like a war bond application. And the name was Sarah White, and the guy's name was Farrier White. But I was like, okay, was that his wife? And then I did a little more reading, and I saw that she had checked Miss, MISS, and I thought, oh, that must be a sister, right? And so then I took that and I sort of ran with it. I knew where he was from, and that's how. And I tracked her down because I looked up some newspaper clippings, and a few years ago there was a street that was named after him, and lo and behold, there was a Sarah White Price who was at the street naming. And then I called the organization that had organized the street naming, and I asked them if they could put me in touch with her. They put me in touch with her daughter, and then her daughter put me in touch with her. And yes, she ended up being the sister. She ended up being the sister of this airman, and sadly, and we had lovely conversations. And I got a note from her daughter last week or week before, I believe it was week before last, that she had died. She was 7, and I had just sent her a copy of the book, and I said to her daughter, I said, I'm sorry that she didn't get to read her words in this book. And she said, but the book came, and I told her that the book was here, and she opened her eyes before
wow.
So she knew that the book,
good.
That was in that book.
Well, you know, and it's Chris's turn, but
go ahead.
No, I don't have a question. I just have a comment. But Chris and I both have relations with a number of World War II veterans, and of course, most of them are gone at this point. I have wrote a book and made a movie about a unit, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, and there's 3 of those soldiers still alive, and they're all over 100. But that's always like you're on tenterhooks every day, like thinking that you're gonna get news that somebody's passed away or somebody's gone. And it's just, if once you start dealing with World War II, right, that's just the baggage that you take on.
Yeah, you know, it's different than when you're doing a story. You go, okay, I can, you know, call this person next week or something. But with this, it was like every moment, as far as I was concerned, mattered, particularly with the living pilots, because they were all approaching 100. General McGee was 101 by the time I met with him at his home. And, you know, I just knew that I needed to do this.
And you're doing a great job with the light there, by the way. Okay.
Thank you.
I know Cheryl's got a weird lighting situation, but she's coping very well.
So, all right. So
Cheryl,
Cheryl,
cuts off, the light cuts off. So
just flap your arms. That worked for me once. So why don't you tell us now? So we've talked about Tuskegee. Talk a little bit about when the unit's going overseas, who's landing them, where are they flying from? What are they getting up to?
You mean where were they coming and going?
Yeah, so when do they deploy to Europe, and what are they doing once they get there? Where are they flying from? And so I want to set the scene for some of these. Yeah. Set the scene for some of these missions where your men get lost flying from.
So they were sent to, well, initially North Africa, the 99th, but then they ended up in Ramatelli in Italy. There was an airfield, Ramatelli airfield in Italy, and they were flying various places. I mean, they were, going to Germany and other places in Italy, Montecovino and other places in Italy, and they were escorting. A lot of times, they were escorting bombers, the white bomber pilots, and sometimes they were just going on, various missions, strafing missions, and training missions, and those kinds of things. Okay. So they were all around, Austria and all around that area.
Right.
So can you remember, what was the first one that you started to dig into? Who was the first missing, but did you go in chronological order or just in whatever order the files showed up on your research card, or where'd you start?
I'm not sure I had a order. I just probably went down, the list of 27. And the first thing I did, though, I tried to find if there were any witnesses to the disappearance of these men. And that's what I really tried to figure out. It's like, okay, because they would be as old as the pilots. And so I thought, okay, were these, and I found two actually. And one was Lieutenant Colonel Harry Stewart. I want to say that. The other was Harold Brown. It wasn't Harry Stewart. It was Harold Brown. And he witnessed one of the guys go down. And then there was Lieutenant Colonel George Hardy, whose good friend, Samuel Lieutenant, went down. And so I talked to them about it, but it's funny because I remember it was Harold Brown who remembered in detail, what happened. He remembered when they were, taking off and they were trying to go through the clouds. And when he got up over the clouds, he didn't see the pilot. And so details like that. But then I had to figure out, did these people have relatives? Did they have siblings? Did they have wives? And those records at the National Archives in St. Louis really helped because, one of the records I found, it listed a daughter had actually written the government asking for any medals or any documents that belonged to her dad. And so I didn't even know this particular airman had children. So that was a nice find. And so I tracked her down because luckily in that file, she had her name, address, and phone number in there. So that was one of that's the luck that I talk about. And so I, whenever I called the people, but the first person I called was ironically a woman in Florida, and her brother, Lieutenant James Polkinghorne. I always start with odd names because they're usually easier to find people and relatives with those kinds of, with the unusual names. And so I reached out to her, and she was lovely, but she wasn't a chatterbox. I told her who I was. I told her that my dad, was an airman, and she was very, like I said, she was very lovely, but not a whole lot of information. And that's the thing. It's like when you go and you talk to people and you interview them, they're not going to spill their guts to you in the first conversation, right? They have to sort of feel you out and get to know you. And so anyway, so she didn't remember a lot of things. She didn't say, I don't think I have many details, blah, 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 blah. So, we talked many times. And finally I said to her, probably a couple years later, I said, would it be okay if I came to visit you, in Florida? And she's like, well, yeah, I guess it's okay. Sure. So I said, okay, great. I said, could you do me a favor? Could you check to see if you have anything, any letters, any photos, anything, newspaper clippings, whatever? So she says, yeah. She says, I'm not sure that I have anything, but I'll check. So I get to Florida. She's still living in the homestead where she grew up, and she's 92 at this point. And memory is sharp. These people had amazing memories. So I get there, and she takes me into the sort of the parlor, and there's this coffee table, and there's documents and photos and everything. And I'm like, wait a minute, didn't we have this conversation? She didn't think she had anything. And that's what I always tell my students too. There's always a place to go, right? You just can't do phone interviews and think you're going to get everything. And so, I mean, it was a gold mine. There were these letters, these two letters that she had from her brother that he had written home to the mom. And in these letters, he talked about these two guys. and they were mentioned in both letters. And so I finally said to her, I said, Mrs. Wilson, I said, who were these guys that your brother talks about? And she says, oh, they were like his playmates growing up. They were like his best friends. And so she said, both of them became doctors, because one of them in the letter was sort of he wanted to be in the military, and for whatever reason he didn't go, and he ended up going to medical school. And so they lived around the corner. Their father was the Episcopal priest. He was the pastor of the church around the corner. And so I said, what was their last name? And because he didn't say the last name, and she said, oh, Shirley. And she says, oh, yeah. She said, and there was a third brother. And I said, what was his name? She said, he was a pianist. She said, his name was Don. I said, a pianist named Don Shirley. I said, Don Shirley, as in Green Book, the movie about the pianist who was driven by a racist guy through the South. And I just like rattled it off. And she looked at me, she says, uh-huh. And I'm like, and I'm sounding like this Green Book groupie, because it's one of my favorite movies. I've seen it like a half dozen times.
Wow.
And she was so unimpressed. But it's like, those are the things that you can't get in a phone conversation.
Yeah.
I never would have known that, so it was those kinds of details that I think really helped me with this book and helped bring the various stories alive.
Oh, I want to talk about some of the stories in a minute, but one of the things I was curious about, I know you track down the families, but you also, talked to a few of the surviving members of the unit. When you told them that you were trying to find their lost buddies, how did they react to that?
Well, the first person I did sit down with was General Charles McGee, who was probably one of the most well-known of the Tuskegee Airmen, and he lived in suburban Washington. And again, he was 101 at the time, and it took me a minute to get through to his daughter to get to him, but she was very gracious, and she arranged a time for me to come by the house and spend the afternoon with him. And I did, and my dad has an album. He has a photo. I actually have it here. He has a photo album. He had a photo album. And so I took the album with me because it turns out that General McGee and my dad were in the same fighter squadron, in the same class, and the class of 43F. And so I took the book, and there were pictures of my dad, and he would go through, General McGee would slowly go through the book. And he noticed my dad, and I said, do you remember him? And he said, now granted, it's almost 80 years, and he says, he looks familiar. He says, but I can't recall a name. And then there were others in the book, some he recognized. There was one in particular he recognized. It was Vance Marchbanks, who was this prominent, doctor who did some things with the space program, and he remembered him. Yeah. And there were other guys. He says, I can't remember the name, but he looks familiar. So, at 101, I mean, the fact that he would remember as much as he did was totally impressive to me. And so, so he didn't know what happened to some of these guys. He didn't, because he made a career out of the military. And then when I went to, I sat down via Zoom with Lieutenant Colonel Harry Stewart, who lived in suburban Detroit, and he just died last year at 100. He had the list of everybody, like all the airmen, and he knew who these guys were, and he could rattle off details about some of these men. They remember. I mean, it's it's hard not to, because you have to remember there were 355 of them who went over there, the pilots who went over to Europe, and that's all they have is each other. So they're going to be as close knit as you can be, because
but I was curious, like, did they say, oh, you're not going to be able to do it, or did they encourage you? Did they tell you, we've been trying, we couldn't find them? I mean, kind of what was?
No, and it wasn't their role to find them, because they weren't on the, the people who went looking, the airmen who went looking for their brethren, were the ones who were on missions with them. Yeah. Right? Like if they disappeared and didn't come back, some of them, I remember in one instance, there was a guy who went back and then he ran low on fuel. So he had to get back to the base. It wasn't like the General McGee's, unless he happened to be on a mission with someone. The people who were who were charged with finding them was the military,
Yeah.
right? Was the government. And that, that's a good question for them. It's like, why didn't you look for these men in a timely manner? In some instances, it was enemy territory where they might have gone down, and so it's dangerous. I get that. But then, sometimes it took them years, after the war ended, maybe, in 1950, 1951 or something, they would go back, and not sure what they were hoping to find, but clearly they were hoping to find the remains. And then at some point, I don't know what happened, because the families I talked to, and there were many, said they haven't heard from the government in decades.
Well, Rick, if you don't mind,
go ahead.
That was something. I mean, obviously, the broad outline of the Tuskegee story has kind of become popular history, right? So that's inspiring. That's not, everybody likes that story, but one of the things that really struck me in reading the book was most of the families that you interviewed, I don't know all of them, but most of them, they would say they never looked for him, or I never heard from anybody, or so that,
or Virginia, who the daughter of Lieutenant Henry Prowl, who said, I think they would have spent more time looking for him had he been white.
Right. So do you think is that a fair criticism of what the military did when these men went missing, or is this kind of the family's grief talking? How do you feel about the efforts to find these guys that were lost?
Well, based on the documents I had access to, which were the military records, in some instances it would say at the bottom that we didn't look for them for whatever reason. We just didn't search for them. Do I think it's a fair criticism? Listen, they've had 80 years. And it wasn't until 2011 when a research analyst, Josh Frank, came along, and his job was to find the missing World War II people, not necessarily Tuskegee. Yeah. And he took it upon himself to make it Tuskegee. And, he's this young, white, former military guy who decided, this is important enough where I think this is where I want to focus. And it was he who helped find Captain Dixon, and it was he who helped find Brewer a couple of years ago, right? But now he's, was assigned another job, and so he's not he's not doing what he did. So I don't know if there's anybody. But I will say that the family members too, in some instances said, listen, we submitted our DNA in hopes that we could, they could find some kind of remains or match it or something. And they said, we never heard back. We never heard back from the military. We submitted the DNA. I had a doctorate, a retired anesthesiologist, who is the nephew of one of the pilots. And he said, I submitted my DNA, my cousin submitted DNA, and we never heard back. So he says, I just think it's probably not going to happen in my lifetime. So I think that's a good question for the military, is what is the military doing? You found too, clearly they're not going to find everybody, because I'm sure some of these men are at the bottom of the Mediterranean, and it's virtually impossible, even though technology has changed a lot in 80 years. Right. So, never say never, but the question is, what are they doing now, and why, if they're doing something, why haven't they been in touch with these family members? Because I could find the family members, and if I could find them,
and I mean, we're kind of jumping around here, but you had mentioned Josh Frank, and he is the guy who found through his efforts Fred Brewer, and found the other officer,
Lawrence Dixon, Captain
Dixon, and it seemed like in the manuscript of the book that you were optimistic that they were likely to find some others, and now what's going on? Josh, have they taken Joshua Frank off that, or did he just have a career change, or what happened there?
Well, I mean, you'd have to ask Josh, but I think he had a career change. I mean, I think, something, I don't know. I'm not going to speak for Josh.
Sure.
But I know he was pretty certain that he was close to finding the airplanes of two others, because I mentioned it in the book. that he was close to it, and then he changed jobs, and now he's on the other side of the country, and he's doing something totally different. But so the question is, who replaced him, and are they looking as hard as Josh did? Because Josh sort of gave he was like really serious about this, right? I mean, every waking moment he was like going over to Italy and connecting the dots and looking at documents and
to talk to us about the two people who were found and how that happened, because it is an interesting story. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, Captain Dixon was found over in Austria, and I want to say it was Austria. Don't get me wrong; it could have been.
Some of this stuff happens on the Austria-Italy border. It's confusing.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think that's why they didn't find him initially. Is they were looking. They being the military they were looking
in the wrong country. Right.
They were looking in Italy, and he was not in Italy, which is why they didn't find him. And so it was Josh who put two and two together through maps, through airplane, records that he had access to over there, and to people over there, and that's how he sort of put two and two together. And then he assembled this archaeological team from the University of New Orleans that went over there, and they found the remains. But what was interesting is I, with the help of Josh, found a guy who is Austrian, who was born and raised right down the street, literally from where Captain Dixon's plane crashed. And even though he wasn't born at the time, he had an older brother, and his older brother used to take him when he was a kid to that crash site, and they would dig for airplane parts. And one day they went there, the two of them went there, and they were digging, and they dug up a bone, a human remain, and it scared them so badly they never went back. And so fast forward, the team, after Josh figured out sort of the area, the trees, he said, were still like charred from back then where the plane, went down, and the team went and they dug. And I talked to the guy, one of the students. He was a graduate student. I talked to him a couple of times about it, and he was the one who was digging, and he unearthed a ring. And it was a ring with aquamarine, I think was the stone, and it had an inscription in there, and it was the initials of Captain Dixon, and from his wife, and his birth date, which was, I believe, May 31st. And so, and the guy, his name was Titus. When Titus found it, he just sort of like, oh my God, like, I found this guy. And he just, he was just so, he was nervous. He was in awe. He was just, he had all of these emotions, and he was the one who dug up that ring. And then of course they did the DNA testing, and they did everything they could. And it was a match. And he had one daughter, Captain Dixon had one daughter, who had looked for years and years and years and years. And she said she was told by the government that there weren't any records on him. And, she said they were burned in the fire, and which, it was not completely true. But that's how they found him. And she, she could actually get a little closure from that.
So Cheryl, I don't want to, give away too much of the book, and I don't want, this to sound sort of kind of flippant, but maybe you could just pick one or two of the others that haven't been found, tell us their story, and at least some sort of memorial. Right?
Oh gosh,
We'll pick one.
Well, maybe
which was my favorites. Well, I think I will say I think that Lieutenant Prowell, Virginia's, her name is Virginia Prowell Ferris. Her dad was an interesting guy because he was a test pilot, she said, and he loved flying, and he was a college graduate. He came out of Knoxville College in Tennessee, and he was the only one, to my knowledge, who had 3 children. He had a wife and 3 children, and Virginia was the oldest, and she was 3 at the time. So she remembers a lot about her dad and the time that they spent together. And she said that he used to write home a lot about flying the planes, and he loved flying those planes. But there was one plane that really frightened him, and it was the P-39. And he told his wife and his family, "Don't worry about me unless I'm flying the P-39." And you know where this story is going, but you got to read the book to figure out how it really.
Sure.
But that's one, because he just had this interesting story. He had these, he had these 3 children, and it was actually his 3rd child was born, and he never got to see his 3rd child. He didn't even know that it was, that it was a boy. So the letters between he and his wife crossed in the mail, and so they just didn't come in time. So that's one story.
So somebody else I wanted to ask you about was the sister of veteran Doris Maples, who's the brother of Captain Andrew Maples. Can you tell us a little bit about meeting her and about that whole story?
Sure. And I keep in touch with all of these people. These people are lovely. I will say this. I think they were just waiting for someone to come along and ask. It was sort of like there wasn't anyone. There was one person I reached out to, and he just didn't respond. And he was the one son of an airman, but I couldn't get him. I sent him a letter. I did everything, and he just didn't want to be bothered. But Mrs. Maples, and it's Walker, Mrs. Walker, she was 4. There she is. She was 4 years old. She lives in the DC area, actually. And she was 4 years old when her brother went missing. She clearly was the youngest in the family. And they grew up in Southern Virginia. And everybody in that family was in the military. There were a ton of siblings, and they all, even the daughters, either married somebody in the military or were in the military. I believe they married. And her brother went off, and, he went on a mission, and he never came back, and the parents never. I don't know how you get over it anyway, but the parents never got over it. And of course they died, and there's one other sibling left besides Mrs. Walker. There's a sister, another sister, and she never got closure. She hasn't heard. She told me she hasn't heard from the government in decades, and she's in her 80s, very much. Sharp, and would love to hear from the government, love to hear something about whatever happened to her brother, but so far nothing.
I think it's your question there.
Oh, I thought that one was my question.
Okay.
No.
That's actually I have one.
No. I've got one, but you go ahead.
Make up your mind. So, Cheryl, you kind of touched on this too, but one of the other sort of subplots of the book, and the one that I was really moved by, are these families. So, could you maybe touch on the impact of this loss on these families, and a lot of them, they're married, they're very young, they have infant children, and these mothers and these families are having to kind of continue on. So, it's a big question, but how does this loss and the manner of the loss affect these families kind of going forward?
Well, I think the biggest loss is they never got closure. There's one sister. It was Lieutenant Samuel Lieutenant out of New York, and I remember visiting with his siblings. His sister she died last year. She was 104. She was actually the first Black Army nurse after President Truman desegregated the military. I actually did an obituary on her for NPR, but I remember spending time with her and her sister, her younger sister, who was like in her 90s. And the sister told me, she said, and the sister never married. And she still lives in the family homestead. And she said, when she and her sisters they would tour Europe together, because they were, the sisters a couple of them were nurses, and they were based over in Europe, and they would tool around. And anytime they saw like a Black man who was the age of their brother, they would look and say, "Are you my brother? Are you my brother?" I mean, they never gave up hope that they would find him. And the sister, the remaining, the sole sister of it, there were 12 or 13 of them, said to me, she said, I kept the phone number the same in case he showed up and needed to
Mm,
go home. He would have, and I thought, oh my God, like how, it just
yeah.
like it touched me. And she said she had to change like the first three numbers or something when the area code or something changed for New York. But other than that, she kept the numbers the same because she wanted him to be able to find his family if miraculously he showed up.
Wow. And there's a great mystery surrounding his remains, Lieutenant. I was fascinated by that. Can you give us a brief description of that? Because I read it twice. I still didn't like quite understand what was going on there.
I know, I read it more than twice and still was like struggling with it. But apparently they found remains they believed were his. And somehow either the paperwork got screwed up, the bodies got screwed up. And so they found remains, but they buried them somewhere where unless you are certain that person is in that coffin, you can't unearth them. So the question now remains, will they ever be able? He's there. They've found his remains, but the question is, where is he buried and how can you prove it? And so I know that was frustrating for Josh too, because he's the one who said either the paperwork got screwed up or something. But that and that's one of the men whose nephew is a retired anesthesiologist who said he gave his DNA. So.
Well, trying to. No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I wondered, you focus on the missing men, and one of the great things that you did, if you buy this book, you'll see that Cheryl has told the story of each one of these men and of their families, if she could find family members left, and of their time up to their mission, and of what the military said happened to them, and that is sort of very moving as you go individual by individual. I'm wondering if, in focusing on these 27 missing men and their families, what have you learned about the Tuskegee Airmen or about World War II that you might not have known otherwise?
One of the things I learned and I had to keep telling myself as I was researching and reporting and writing this, is how young these men were. They were 20 something and they seemed so much older in their stories that the families told, in their letters that they wrote home, in the documentation I found. They just seemed sort of like these old souls. So that's one thing I learned, that these men were out of high school, straight out of high school or straight out of college, and their lives were just starting. And all of them disappeared before the age of 30. The oldest one was 28 and the youngest one was 20, who went missing. And they had their whole lives ahead of them. So that's one thing. The other thing I realized is that they were to listen to their families, they were very close to their families. They were close-knit families. Everybody I talked to, a lot of these guys came from huge families, by the way, and they had all these siblings, and they had people who cared about them and who just never got closure. And I never think of, like, when you think of somebody who's MIA, it's like, life goes on, right? Not for these families. Yes, life went on for them, but you bring it up again and they'll take you right back to 1943 and 1944 and 1945 about when that call came to the parents and what the parents' reaction was. I mean, they remember it like it was yesterday.
It's like the war never ended for them.
That's right. That's deep. That's a deep-seated grief. That they will never get over. I know that Mrs. Ferris, Virginia Prower Ferris, told me that, she's still waiting. She says, I still have hope that somebody's going to knock on my door and say, we found your dad.
Well, Cheryl, thank you so much for joining us today. on History Happy
Cheryl.
Hour to talk about your book. And thank you for leaving this monument to the missing 27 airmen of the Tuskegee Airmen. And your book, of course, is Forgotten Souls, The Search for the Lost Tuskegee Airmen.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, Cheryl, when you fly over, we'll knock on the castle together. We'll just knock on the door and say,
Oh yeah, he lives by so he was telling me he lives by King Charles, and I'm like,
Yeah.
I want to be there when you go knock on his
They're
door.
like this. They're like this. Yeah. But Cheryl, I hope I think and I think our audience hopes, from when I was looking at the comments, that I hope somebody great replaces Joshua Frank. I hope that they continue efforts to find these guys. The U.S. government has generally has a reputation for really trying to track this down and to kind of stay on it. And I hope that happens in this case. And if it does,
for the family's sake.
I do. And I hope if it does happen, I hope you let us know about it, and we'll bring you back on to talk about it.
I will. And I have a website in case,
Oh, please.
The website, if you got tips or something, it's CherylWThompson.com.
CherylWThompson.com. That's where you can check out the book. You can leave information, ask questions, etc. Again, Cheryl, thank you so much.
Thank you guys so much.
Bye-bye.
Okay. So, Chris, next week, you'll be in Gibraltar.
I will.
You're not grounded because of your medical issues, right?
No. I booked this vacation. I'm going.
So you're on vacation on the rock.
I'm on
and we'll have an encore episode. So continuing our Black History Month theme, we'll replay our interview with Rob Child, who, of course, wrote the book Immortal Valor, Black Medal of Honor recipients of World War II. And so that's some great stories there. And we'll talk to Rob and get all those from him in that encore episode.
Right.
It leaves you speechless, huh?
I'm looking forward to it, and looking forward to going to Gibraltar. And,
what does one do in Gibraltar?
Well, apparently we're staying at a really great Art Deco hotel with views of the ocean. So I have gin and tonics in the sun, and then plan to go to see the tunnels where Eisenhower had his headquarters.
I figured that'd be part of it. Yeah. Okay.
And then to go, since you're the Rev War guy, I'm going to go to see the remains of the longest battle
of the American Revolution. Right. There you go.
A history-orama, and then I'm going to get chased around by monkeys, apparently.
Spain plays a big role in the revolution, which is a little underplayed in our histories, but also trying to bring that back with a tour. So,
so if I see anything good, I'll let you know.
Yeah, because we can always, do 3 or 4 days in the U.S. and then fly to Gibraltar for a day.
Yep.
That makes perfect sense. Guys, thank you so much for joining us. Please subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, shout at us on Blue Sky, listen to our podcast, back us at patreon.com, and browse historyhappyhour.com.
Thanks, everybody. Stay safe.